مرحبا بكم مشاهدينا في حوارات السياق. سلطت الأزمة الأوكرانية الضوء على مفارقة قاسية لسياسة الولايات المتحدة في الشرق الأوسط، إذ استيقظت إدارة بايدن على حقيقة مؤلمة تتمثل في تعاطف حلفائها وشركائها مع أوكرانيا مع التزامهم تجاه الولايات المتحدة، لكنهم غير مستعدين لاتخاذ موقف ضد موسكو. للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا دكتور دونالد جنسن، الدبلوماسي الأمريكي السابق ومدير شؤون روسيا والاستقرار الاستراتيجي في معهد الولايات المتحدة للسلام. دكتور دونالد، مرحبا بك معنا.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
ما مدى التغيير في الشرق الأوسط نتيجة القرار الذي اتخذه الرئيس باراك أوباما والذي تبناه رئيس دونالد ترامب وفرضه الآن جو بايدن لوضع الشرق الأوسط في أسفل قائمة أولويات السياسة الخارجية لواشنطن؟ ما هي العواقب؟
Well, thank a very complicated question. Thank you for that. Let me say that I do not think the Middle East is the bottom of the priorities of the U.S. administration. And I would point out the fact that the Washington has been lobbying many of our partners in the Gulf for energy in case the Europeans need energy supplies if the Russians cut off their supplies. What has happened geopolitically, I think, and to some extent, I agree with your premise, is that since by the Obama administration, the Russian presence in the region has become much stronger, and the U.S. has been a less direct participant. But that does not mean that the Middle East is not central to our geopolitical calculations. First of all, and I think I look at the region not as the Middle East, I look at various power arrangements, Iran, Israel, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia. All of these I regard as important actors which ought to be treated diplomatically by the U.S. one-on-one, because all these countries don't always share the same interests. And of course, above all, Turkey, which is a NATO member and very important for the current Ukraine-Russia crisis.
إسرائيل أكدت على الحياد فيما يتعلق بالأزمة مع أوكرانيا، هي التي لديها جالية كبيرة هناك.
Well, I think that if I understand your question correctly, I think that, as I said, the Biden administration is very interested in working with the countries of this region. The Biden administration realizes how important they are. You know, and one of the highlights, I think, of this crisis, maybe a benefit, if there can be said to be benefits, is that the United States, I think, will again be reminded of the geopolitical importance of the Middle East. And that's important, whether it's, even if you take out Iran from the equation, but the countries themselves are very important. Those who are critics of the US administration do criticize Biden, and as well as Trump, for not being a more forceful actor in the region and letting it appear to go toward Russia and Tehran. And that's something a lot of people are upset by, troubled by, and do hope the U.S. comes to play a more active role in the Middle East.
ما قصدته بسؤالي، هل تمسك روسيا إسرائيل من يدها التي تؤلمها؟ هل من الممكن أن توقف روسيا تدخلات تل أبيب عبر المجال الجوي السوري؟
Well, if you want the opinion of myself, a former diplomat, it's that the U.S. made a mistake in not pushing back on Russia's involvement in Syria more aggressively 6, 8 years ago, 9 years ago. I regard the Russian involvement in Syria as as we say, a test of Russia's ability to project power overseas, and what it's done so in a way, but it's also brutally, violently caused the immigrant problem that has affected several countries in the region, most notably Turkey. And I think a lot of observers here in Washington regret that posture by the Obama administration, hope the U.S. can re-inject itself more forcefully in the region. And frankly, I expect that will be the case. This crisis, as I said, has shown the importance of these countries. And it's not going to be something the U.S. will forget about. As for Syria, it's a failed state. It's a tragic state. We need to rebuild the country if that's possible. And we also need to, I think, resist further Russian expansion of its influence in the Middle East. The Middle East really has not a lot in common with Russia in general. And I think Russia is not a partner in a natural way to the countries of the region. The US is a more natural partner of these countries, and I think the Biden administration realizes that.
ماذا عن الخليج؟ دعنا نبدأ مثلا بالكويت، الحليف الوثيق للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية تحديدا بعد حرب الخليج. لماذا لم تكن حساسة بشكل خاص لمخاطر رضوخ المجتمع الدولي لجار كبير يغزو دولة صغيرة؟
Well, excellent question. I would actually mention Kabul and the disaster there as an event which undermined the credibility of the United States in the region. I think the Biden administration, my personal view, made a large mistake in letting that happen the way that it did. And this sends a message to smaller countries, like, as you say, like Kuwait and elsewhere, that the United States is not a reliable partner. So I think when you look at the US reaction now and the current crisis with Ukraine, you see a lesson learned by Washington that you cannot people pay attention, as you are right now. People pay attention to what the US says and does. And if you want to have credibility, you have to protect your partners. Even in Ukraine, as visible and strong as our support has been, you see there are limits to US assistance. And as you probably know, in Washington, there was a very vigorous debate about what's the proper level of support given the Russian threat. But as you also know, US cannot intervene everywhere at all times to support countries and people we back. It has to calculate the costs and benefits. And Ukraine being in Europe, Ukraine being a democracy, Ukraine being a longtime partner of the United States, it's much easier to defend them than it is some of the countries we'd like to defend, like Afghanistan, but cannot due to geographic and other reasons. And I'll say as a former diplomat, we do make contradictory decisions sometimes, and you're absolutely right to ask why there's a contradiction. And the answer is there is sometimes a contradiction. The values are different, the calculations are different, and the administration is different. And I very much understand and sympathize with your point about the credibility of the United States. I was one of those critical of the Biden people for how they handled Afghanistan, as I said, but I think they've been very good here. And I think in the future, when small countries in the Middle East look at the United States and the degree of its support for Ukraine, I think they're going to see that the US still is a reliable partner and a good partner and a partner with whom they can do business.
هل لم تعد الولايات المتحدة شريكاً موثوقاً به في أمن المنطقة؟
To be honest, we're again contradictory. The US seeks to have a balance of the two factors you mentioned, human rights, democracy, and geopolitical interests or energy. And the response the US makes in policy terms is often contradictory. And you and others are correct to point that out. But what happened because of Afghanistan is that increasingly the US is less confident it can build a democracy in some of these places which are very different from the United States. And that's one of the lessons, I think, from Kabul, where we spent so much money, so long, and lost so many soldiers. So I think what you're going to see is not an attempt to promote democracy so insistently. You're going to see the US defend democracy where it exists. And that's a fundamental change, I think, from the previous two administrations. Biden was much more aggressive democracy promoter. Obama was a much more aggressive democracy promoter. The Biden people are quite different.
المملكة العربية السعودية بعلاقات عميقة مع الولايات المتحدة، هل ستهدد علاقتها بروسيا شريك الرياض في تحديد أسعار النفط بعد اتفاق توسط فيه ترامب إذا تتذكر؟
Exactly, yes. The problem with our relationship with Saudi Arabia is two parts. Number one, is the human rights issue, and whereas there's been tension between the two countries for a number of years. The second is that Saudi Arabia in the energy sector does have a relationship of sorts with the Russians, so they are less willing to support the United States in its support for Ukraine. That's why I think the Gulf states, Qatar and elsewhere, are much more natural allies because the relationship is not complicated in the way that it is with Saudi Arabia. And I would remind you that most Americans don't pay much attention to foreign policy. So these contradictions that you point out are things that most Americans barely even read about. And so this ends up being the product of the diplomatic service of the United States and the different presidential administrations. And that's where we are now.
تعتقد أن واشنطن ستعيد ترتيب علاقتها مع ولي العهد السعودي؟
I think the United States, the bottom line is that it values Saudi Arabia as an ally and partner for a variety of reasons, one of which is their energy riches. And I think one reason you see Washington working to get around some of the differences about human rights is precisely this reason. It's because the geopolitical importance of Saudi Arabia is so big and so strong that the United States tends to overlook a little bit some of its concerns about human rights. I would also point out, by the way, you mentioned Egypt, that the revolution in the Arab Muslim countries 11 years ago really was a lesson for a lot of people who pay attention to to developments there. A lot of people thought that was going to be the first step toward the democratization of the Middle East, and it didn't happen. So the lesson to a lot of people, even those who worked for President Obama at the time, the lesson was we should be less enthusiastic about pushing democratic change, and we should be more concerned about protecting the geopolitical interests of the United States. And that is a lesson a lot of people have taken from the events in Egypt so long ago, but still resonating now for a lot of people who pay attention.
هل باتت روسيا قوة الوضع الراهن في الشرق الأوسط؟ وصارت الولايات المتحدة في المقابل بعد دعمها للربيع العربي كأنها تروج لعدم الاستقرار في المنطقة.
The instability, yes, absolutely. One of the problems with I love my country deeply, but one of the problems of my country is that we have trouble understanding cultural differences in countries, even when we want to be their friends. And so we tend to make the same kind of mistakes again and again. And I'm partly responsible, since I used to work for the US government. We tend to think that everybody wants democracy as we understand it. And we tend to think that cultural and history is not as important in other places as it is here. And this gets into all sorts of problems when making our foreign policy. We have to be better. We, the United States, has to be better at understanding these differences. And we are trying. When you see that the Arab Spring, I don't like to call it that, the Arab Spring did not result in democracies all over the region. Serious people, meaningful people, look at that and try to draw lessons from that to make our policy better and more effective.
هل ستغير الولايات المتحدة من استراتيجيتها في المنطقة بعد هذا التغير الواضح في مواقف حلفائها؟
I think the United States at the moment is preoccupied by what's the greater threat, Russia or China? And both countries have made a good case to be number one. And we disagree about that all the time. Some people think we should focus on China, others Russia. I personally think they're both threats to the region, to Europe, and to US security. In this debate, it's inevitable, we are going to inevitably come to the conclusion that the Middle East is a key actor in this drama. And I think that's going to happen before too long, because the world is much more complex than some professors in Washington say when they're arguing about China first or Russia first. The world is changing. The Middle East is playing a key role in those changes. And that means that sometimes events are going to be beyond our control, as we saw in Afghanistan. It means that not everybody, every place, every time is going to think like we do. It means that Saudi Arabia is important as an ally, even if a partner, even if we disagree on some issues. And I think we're coming around to that view much more quickly than some people might think.
شكرا دكتور دونالد جنسن دبلوماسي الأمريكي السابق على المشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
My pleasure, anytime.
مشاهدينا شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.